Beyond the veil, a journey through death's doorway. The moment everything changed, Alexander Dimitrov sat comfortably on his sister's plush sofa, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the half-drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. At 56, he had the distinguished appearance of a man who had spent his life in pursuit of knowledge. Silver-flecked dark hair meticulously combed back from a high forehead, wire-rimmed glasses perched on a prominent nose, and hands that moved with precision when he spoke about his work in quantum physics. The new quantum entanglement project is showing remarkable promise, Alexander explained to his sister, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea warming his palms. We've managed to maintain particle correlation at distances previously thought impossible. If our calculations are correct, Catherine, we might be on the verge of... The sentence remained forever unfinished. A sudden violent cough interrupted him, sharp and jarring in the peaceful room. His body tensed, the teacup slipping from his grasp and shattering against the floor. Alexander's hand flew to his chest, clutching at his sweater as though trying to reach inside his own ribcage. His eyes widened with a primal fear, pupils dilating as oxygen deprivation set in. Then stillness, complete devastating stillness. Catherine Ivanova, a neurologist with 25 years of medical experience at Stockholm's prestigious Karolinska Institute, recognized the signs before her conscious mind could process them. Her brother wasn't breathing. No pulse drummed beneath her fingertips when she pressed them against his neck. No rise and fall of his chest. His head had lolled backward, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the ceiling. Alexander, can you hear me? Catherine's training took over as she lowered him to the floor, clearing his airway and beginning chest compressions with methodical precision. Stay with me, Sasha. She had witnessed death countless times throughout her career, had pronounced patients gone, had comforted families in their grief, but nothing had prepared her for the raw terror of watching her only brother slip away under her hands. Breathe, damn it, she shouted, her medical composure fracturing. She continued CPR relentlessly, tears blurring her vision as minutes stretched into eternity. 8 minutes, 8 excruciating minutes of fighting against the most fundamental boundary of existence. Catherine had almost surrendered to despair when Alexander's body suddenly convulsed beneath her hands. A ragged, wheezing intake of breath broke the terrible silence. His eyelids fluttered, then opened fully, revealing eyes that seemed somehow changed deeper, more luminous, as if they had absorbed light from somewhere beyond comprehension. His first whispered words chilled her to the bone, despite her scientific skepticism. This isn't the end, Catherine, he murmured, voice barely audible. There's life there too, but it's so different, so much better. The physicist who saw beyond before this moment, Alexander Dimitrov, had been the embodiment of rational materialism. A quantum physicist with 3 published books on particle theory and numerous peer-reviewed papers, he had built his intellectual identity on empirical evidence and mathematical certainty. At Cambridge University, colleagues had nicknamed him the calculator for his unwavering insistence that everything, even consciousness itself, could eventually be reduced to quantifiable equations. Spiritual experiences are simply neurochemical events, he had once declared during a university panel discussion. The dying brain creates comforting hallucinations as consciousness fades. There's nothing mystical about it. Now, lying on his sister's living room floor with oxygen gradually returning to his brain, Alexander found himself in the impossible position of having to reevaluate everything he had ever believed. The visit to Catherine's apartment had been intended as a brief respite from his demanding research schedule, a few hours of familial comfort, tea and conversation before returning to the laboratory. They had reminisced about their childhood in Moscow, laughed about their father's terrible cooking attempts after their mother died, and discussed Catherine's recent research into brain plasticity. Alexander had been animated, gesturing enthusiastically as he described the theoretical implications of his team's latest findings. Then came the cough, then cardiac arrest, something else entirely. Catherine helped him to the sofa, her medical training battling with sisterly concern. Alexander, you just experienced a severe cardiac event. We need to get you to a hospital immediately. No, he replied with unexpected firmness. Not yet. I need to tell you what I saw, what I experienced. You were clinically dead for 8 minutes. Catherine explained, her voice steadying as she retreated into medical terminology. Oxygen deprivation can cause vivid hallucinations. Your brain was... It wasn't my brain, Alexander interrupted, an uncharacteristic certainty in his voice. Or at least not in the way we understand the brain. Catherine studied her brother's face, the face she had known since childhood, now transformed by something she couldn't name. Despite her medical background, an unexpected chill traced her spine. What could possibly have happened in those 8 minutes to change a lifelong skeptic so profoundly? Tell me, she whispered, taking his trembling hand in hers. 8 minutes in eternity. How do I describe infinity using finite language? Alexander began, his gaze distant. How do I explain colors to someone who has only ever seen in black and white. Catherine remained silent, allowing her brother to gather his thoughts. As a neurologist, she had heard accounts of near-death experiences before the tunnel of light, the feeling of peace, deceased relatives welcoming the dying. She had always explained them as the brain's final comfort mechanisms, neurochemical cascades creating hallucinations to ease the transition toward oblivion. But Alexander's account was different. More specific, I didn't wake up as you might expect after unconsciousness, he explained, his voice strengthening. I transitioned. One moment, I was here, feeling the pain in my chest. I was elsewhere, but elsewhere isn't the right word because it implies a physical location. He paused, struggling with the limitations of language. There was no body to feel, Catherine. No. Restrictions, no pain. Imagine consciousness without its container, pure, awareness flowing freely. I could perceive in all directions simultaneously. I could understand without processing. Knowledge wasn't acquired, it was simply accessible. Catherine nodded, her clinical mask slipping as she listened. This wasn't the typical near-death narrative filled with religious imagery or emotional reunions. This was her analytical brother attempting to describe something with scientific precision. I moved through what felt like a tunnel, but calling it a tunnel doesn't capture it. It was familiar somehow, as though I'd traveled this path before, perhaps in dreams, or perhaps before birth. Alexander's voice lowered to nearly a whisper. The most extraordinary aspect was thought itself. Every thought had immediate consequence. Think of a place, and you were there. Think of an object, and it appeared before you, but not just its physical form. I could perceive its entire history, its purpose, its complete nature. He described how he had thought about the old Sony television that had sat in his apartment for years, unused because of some mysterious malfunction. In this state of expanded awareness, he suddenly understood exactly what component had failed and why. It wasn't just technical knowledge. Catherine, I could see the factory worker in Japan who'd assembled that specific part. Takashi Yamamoto, father of 3, worried about his youngest daughter's school performance while he soldered the connections. One connection made with slightly less attention because of this distraction. I knew his name, his thoughts, his life story all instantaneously. Catherine shifted uncomfortably. Alexander, the brain is capable of creating extraordinarily detailed hallucinations, especially when I fixed the television yesterday. He interrupted. After returning home, the exact component I saw in my vision was indeed faulty. A capacitor on the power supply board that had been improperly soldered. How could my dying brain manufacture such a specific technical detail that proved to be correct? The room fell silent as Catherine struggled to formulate a rational explanation. But that wasn't even the most profound part. Alexander continued. I gradually became aware that I wasn't alone. Not in the sense of seeing other entities or beings, but feeling an unmistakable presence, vast, compassionate, and intimately familiar, as though I was encountering the source from which my own consciousness had originally emerged. Alexander described how this presence communicated, not through words or images, but through direct understanding, knowledge that unfurled within him without the cumbersome mechanics of language. It felt like coming home, Catherine, like remembering something I had always known but had somehow forgotten during my time on Earth. I understood that consciousness isn't produced by the brain, it's channeled through it like light through a prism. The brain doesn't generate awareness, it limits it, focuses it into the narrow band we call human perception. Catherine watched as her brilliant, skeptical brother, the man who had scoffed at spirituality his entire adult life, spoke with the quiet conviction of someone who had glimpsed a deeper reality. This presence, it wasn't controlling or judging. It was nurturing, like a parent guiding a child through unfamiliar territory. I felt completely understood, completely accepted, not just my thoughts and memories, but the entire essence of who I am. Alexander's eyes filled with tears, something Catherine had rarely seen since they were children. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in my mind. I wasn't isolated in my perspective. Everything was connected in patterns of stunning complexity and beauty. The mathematics I've spent my career studying, they're just pale shadows of the fundamental patterns I glimpsed there. Then Alexander described how, just as he was beginning to comprehend this expanded state of being, he felt himself being pulled back. The infinite space began to contract, to accelerate and compress. Around me, I resisted, Catherine. I fought to stay. Everything that matters was there. Everything I've ever sought to understand through science was laid bare, comprehensible at last. But something was drawing me back, forcefully, like being yanked from deep water. He looked directly into his sister's eyes. It was you, your determination bringing me back to this limited existence. I was saving your life, Catherine whispered defensively. Alexander smiled gently. Wes, but now I know that what we call life and what we fear as death are not what we think they are. Not at all. The transformation in the days following his near-death experience. Alexander's colleagues at the Cambridge Quantum Physics Laboratory noticed dramatic changes in his behavior and thinking. The The methodical, cautious scientist had been replaced by someone who approached problems with intuitive leaps that bypassed conventional analysis yet arrived at solutions with uncanny accuracy. Professor Elizabeth Morgan, the laboratory director, and Alexander's longtime research partner, confronted him after a particularly unusual brainstorming session. "What's happened to you, Alexander?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "You've always been brilliant, but this is different. You're making connections that don't follow established logical pathways." "Alexander, I've gained a new perspective, Elizabeth. The mathematical models we've been struggling with for the past 2 years, they're elegant but fundamentally limited because they're based on a flawed understanding of reality itself. And you've somehow corrected this understanding in the span of a week," she asked skeptically. "Not corrected, expanded," he replied. "We've been approaching quantum entanglement as a problem of particles and waves, but it's actually a manifestation of something far more fundamental. Consciousness itself is the missing variable in our equations." Professor Morgan frowned. "That sounds dangerously close to pseudoscience, Alexander. We're physicists, not philosophers. The distinction is artificial," he replied with surprising confidence. "The observer effect in quantum mechanics has always hinted at consciousness's role in physical reality, but we've been reluctant to follow where that evidence leads because it threatens our materialist paradigm." That night, Alexander experienced a vivid dream, though. Dream seemed an inadequate description. He witnessed the complete solution to their quantum guidance system problem, seeing not just the equations, but the underlying principles as though they were transparent. He awoke 17 a.m. and spent the next 4 hours transcribing what he had seen into mathematical notation. When he presented his solution to the research team the following day, the room fell silent. The elegant simplicity of his approach rendered their previous 2 years of work obsolete. "This is revolutionary," Professor Morgan admitted after thoroughly reviewing his calculations. "But I don't understand how you arrived at this. These aren't incremental improvements on our previous work. This is an entirely different framework." Alexander couldn't explain that the solution had come not through conventional analysis, but through a connection to something beyond ordinary consciousness, at least not without risking his professional reputation. Instead, he simply attributed it to a new perspective gained during his recovery. But the changes weren't limited to his professional life. Friends and family noticed a profound shift in Alexander's personality and priorities. The driven, sometimes distant academic became more present, more compassionate. He began volunteering at a hospice center, sitting with terminal patients and speaking with them about their fears of death with a gentle authority that brought remarkable comfort. Catherine observed these changes with a mixture of wonder and scientific curiosity. As a neurologist, she knew that near-death experiences could trigger personality changes, but the transformation in her brother seemed too comprehensive, too consistent to be explained by neurochemical fluctuations alone. "You never believed in anything beyond the material world," she remarked during dinner 6 weeks after his cardiac arrest. "Now you're counseling dying patients about consciousness surviving death. How do you reconcile this with your scientific training?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "I don't see a contradiction. Catherine, science is about following evidence, wherever it leads, even when it challenges our existing paradigms. Greatest scientific revolutions have always begun when anomalous experiences couldn't be explained within the current framework. But subjective experience isn't verifiable data," she countered. "Isn't?" Alexander smiled. "Consciousness itself is subjective, yet it's the foundation of all scientific observation. Without conscious experience, there would be no one to collect or interpret so-called objective data." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What I experienced wasn't a hallucination produced by a dying brain. It was an expansion of awareness beyond the limitations of the brain, a glimpse of the larger reality in which our physical existence is embedded." Catherine studied her brother's face, searching for signs of delusion or cognitive impairment, but found only clarity and conviction. "What if you're right?" she finally asked, the question that had haunted her since his revival. "What would it mean for how we understand?" "Everything. It would mean," Alexander replied gently, "that we've been living with a profound misconception about the nature of consciousness, reality, and death. It would mean that the materialist paradigm that has dominated science for centuries is fundamentally incomplete." He reached across the table and took his sister's hand. "It would mean that what we fear most, the end of our existence, is an illusion. There is no end, Catherine, only transition." The final insight 3 months after his near-death experience. Alexander was invited to present at the International Conference on Consciousness Studies in Vienna, an unprecedented honor for a quantum physicist with no formal background in neuroscience or philosophy of mind. His lecture, titled Consciousness Beyond Materiality, A Quantum Physicist's Journey, drew an overflow crowd of scientists, philosophers, and medical professionals. Standing at the podium, Alexander surveyed the audience, skeptics and believers alike, all united by curiosity about his extraordinary claims. For most of my career, he began, I operated under the assumption that consciousness is an emergent property of brain function, a complex but ultimately reducible phenomenon produced by neurochemical processes. My near-death experience has led me to a radically different conclusion. Consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is rather channeled through it. A murmur rippled through the audience. I recognize the extraordinary nature of this claim. Alexander continued, as scientists, we are rightfully suspicious of anecdotal evidence and subjective experience, but we must also be willing to consider evidence that challenges our existing paradigms, especially when that evidence points consistently in a direction we have been reluctant to explore. For the next hour, Alexander methodically presented his experience, emphasizing the verifiable aspects, like his precise knowledge of the television's mechanical failure, while acknowledging the subjective nature of his broader claims. He presented a theoretical framework that integrated quantum non-locality with consciousness, suggesting that the phenomenon of entanglement might extend beyond particles to include conscious experience itself. During the question and answer session, a prominent neuroscientist challenged him directly. Dimitrov, how can you, as a scientist, ask us, accept your subjective experience as evidence of such extraordinary claims? Couldn't all of this be explained by the known neurochemical processes that occur in a brain experiencing oxygen deprivation? Alexander nodded respectfully. A reasonable question, Dr. Hawkins. If my experience existed in isolation, I would be the first to consider neurochemical explanations. But my account is remarkably consistent with thousands of other near-death experiences reported across cultures, time periods, and belief systems. Moreover, there are elements such as verifiable perception during clinical death that cannot be adequately explained by current neurological models. He paused, surveying the skeptical faces before him. I'm not asking you to abandon scientific rigor. Quite the opposite, I'm asking you to apply it more thoroughly. By considering all available evidence, including subjective reports that consistently point to a reality beyond our current understanding, science advances, not by dismissing anomalous data but by developing new paradigms to account for it. The conference marked a turning point in Alexander's life. While many colleagues dismissed his claims, others were intrigued enough to open new lines of inquiry. Research funding began flowing into studies of consciousness at the quantum level, and Alexander found himself at the center of a growing movement challenging the strictures of scientific materialism. But the most profound change occurred within Alexander himself. The fear that had subtly shaped his entire existence, fear of death, of meaninglessness, of the void, had been replaced by a serene certainty that consciousness continued beyond physical dissolution. 6 months after his near-death experience, Alexander sat in Catherine's living room, the same space where his heart had stopped, where he had glimpsed eternity. His sister had gradually moved from skepticism to cautious openness about his claims, partly due to changes she had observed in her own patients after implementing some of Alexander's suggestions about approaching death with curiosity rather than fear. The greatest tragedy, Alexander remarked, gazing thoughtfully out the window, isn't that we die, it's that we live without realizing what we truly are. Consciousness temporarily localized in physical form but ultimately unbounded by it. Catherine considered his words. You're not afraid anymore, are you? Not just of death, but anything. Not fearless, he corrected with a smile. Just differently afraid. I no longer fear personal extinction because I know it's impossible, but I fear wasting this precious physical experience, this unique perspective. I fear living unconsciously when consciousness itself is the greatest gift. He turned to face his sister fully. What I learned in those 8 minutes of clinical death has transformed every remaining minute of my life. We postpone our deepest questions. We delay our most meaningful connections. Suspend our authentic selves, always waiting for some future moment when conditions will be perfect. And that moment never comes. Catherine finished softly. Exactly. The most dangerous illusion isn't that life continues after death, it's that we have unlimited time before death to become who we truly are. Alexander stood and walked to the exact spot where he had collapsed that fateful day. 8 minutes, Catherine. 8 minutes changed everything. But why wait for death to teach us what life is for? The boundary between worlds is thinner than we imagine, and the greatest insights are available to us now, in this moment, if we're courageous enough to look beyond our limited understanding. The question that changes everything, if Alexander Dimitrov's experience is true, if consciousness indeed extends beyond the brain, if death is truly a transition rather than an ending, then the implications ripple through every aspect of human existence. Philosophy, science, medicine, ethics, religion all require fundamental reconsideration in light of this possibility. But perhaps the most profound implication is also the most personal. How would you live differently if you knew with certainty that physical death is not the end of conscious experience. What fears would lose their power over you? What priorities would shift? What relationships would you nurture more intentionally? Alexander's 8 minutes beyond the veil revealed to him that consciousness is not a fragile flame easily extinguished, but rather an aspect of a greater reality temporarily focused through the lens of physical existence. His greatest regret was not the prospect of death, but the recognition of how much of his life had been spent avoiding the very questions that matter most. We are not human beings having occasional spiritual experiences. He often said in his later lectures, we are spiritual beings having a temporary human experience. In the years following his near-death experience, Alexander published 3 books exploring the intersection of quantum physics and consciousness. He established the Dimitrov Institute for Consciousness Studies, dedicated to rigorous scientific investigation of non-local consciousness and its implications. His work sparked controversy, but also opened new avenues of research that gradually gained mainstream scientific acceptance. But his greatest legacy was more personal to thousands of people who, through his work, found the courage to live more authentically in the face of mortality. People who, like Alexander himself, discovered that accepting the continuation of consciousness beyond death paradoxically enabled them to live more fully within the precious constraints of physical existence. As Alexander often concluded his lectures, the recognition that death is not the end does not diminish the value of this life, it transforms it. When we understand that physical existence is but one expression of our consciousness, every moment becomes an opportunity to experience, to connect, to grow in awareness. The boundaries we perceive between self and other, between life and death, between consciousness and matter are less absolute than we have believed. And in that recognition lies our greatest freedom. What would you do differently if you knew that death is not the end, but a transition? What words would you speak that remain unspoken? What actions would you take that remain undone? What healing would you initiate that remains unstarted? The most profound truth that Alexander discovered beyond the veil of death was not about dying at all, but about living with the awareness that consciousness is not confined to the brain, that love transcends physical boundaries, and that the connections we forge in this existence continue beyond it. The question is not whether consciousness continues after death. The question is, how will this knowledge transform your life while you still draw breath?